chess, tactics win games, plain and simple. In today's video, we're going to be going through the 10 most important tactics, starting with the easy ones that you see all the time, advancing to more complex ones that can decide the outcome of the game in seconds. Whether you're a beginner or an advanced player, I think this video will be helpful to you. Let's jump into the first tactic, the easy one, and this is the fork. As we go through this video, I will do an easier example, and then I'll do a more complicated example of the same type of tactic. So here we have the fork. The fork is where you move one piece and you attack two pieces. So it's also called the double attack. And here we can see our opponent's pieces. They've got 6 main pieces that we can attack. And if you look at those pieces, is there a way we can move one of our pieces to attack 2 of theirs? So if I think about this rook, I could move the rook up here, it only attacks the king. I move the rook up here, it only attacks the queen. I move the bishop here, it doesn't attack anything. I move the queen attacks both. So this is technically a fork, but probably not the best move here, because if I move here, I attack the queen and the king can just kill my queen. And yes, I can capture back with my rook, but then the king captures me and I haven't won any material, I've instead just lost a rook. How can I attack 2 pieces with one of my pieces? Well, hopefully you're able to spot the move knight to h4. And knight to h4 is the winning move because we force the king to move away and now we can capture the queen. This second example is a lot harder, and I think if you want to improve at spotting these kinds of tactics in your game, then you need to look at your opponent's pieces and ask yourself, are there any pieces that are not protected? And yes, this rook and this rook in the corners are not protected, but I'm not going to be able to really attack those. They're too far away. So let's look for some other pieces that are not protected. I can see here that his queen on g4 is not protected. And so I need to start thinking in my mind, how can I attack that piece? Are there any tactics around this? And I immediately see the move, a knight to e5, attacking the queen. But if I just move to e5, then he just moves his queen away. So that's not the tactic. Here I can see, ooh, if I lure the king onto this square, we can attack the king and also fork the queen. So how can I get the enemy king to come to this square? Well, hopefully you can see the beautiful queen sacrifice. Queen sacrifices herself on d7, the king captures, and now we can move our knight to e5. You might be saying, no, wait a minute, Owen, the knight on c6 is just going to eat our knight. Well, that will get us into tactic number 2, which is called the pin. But this piece is not allowed to move because it is pinned to the king. If this piece moves, we eat the king and win the game. And one of the rules in chess is you're not allowed to move your king into danger. So moving this piece would put your king in danger. So we can now move knight to e5 and eat the queen. Just before we continue, lads, I did want to say I've created a free puzzle study over on Noctie. The link's in the description of the video. It's the top link. If you just click on it, you can go here and you can train some of these puzzles. We just went over a fork, so you can read here. A fork is a fundamental chess tactic where a single piece attacks 2 or more targets simultaneously. The attacking piece is called the forking piece, while the pieces under threat are referred to as forked pieces. Let's see an example. Here, the pawn moves forwards from e7 to e5 and attacks both the bishop and the knight. You can train it yourself. Find the best move. Can black win material with a fork? This Noctie study will go through a bunch of the tactics we go through today. Again, this is free. Give it a go. Let me know what you think. Tactic number 2 is called the pin. The pin is where you attack a piece and that piece can't move out of the way because there's a more valuable piece behind it that we would be able to capture. In this position, even though our opponent has a queen, rook, and bishop, and we only have rook and bishop, we actually can win the game. And that's because of the tactic, the pin. And one way to find these kinds of tactical ideas in your games is to look for checks, captures, and threats. Now, in this position, is there any check that we can do with our pieces? And yes, there is. We're going to move our rook to b8 and check the king. And so the king couldn't move anywhere, so he had to block with the bishop. Now, what can we say about that bishop? We can say that it is pinned to the king. So this bishop is not allowed to move back to where it was or to h6, because if it does, we will eat the king, and you're not allowed to move a piece and put your king in danger. So now that we've made a pin, how can we take an advantage of that pin? We need to attack the pinned piece. And how can we attack the pinned piece in this position? Bishop to h6. We're attacking the bishop with 2 pieces, and he's only defending with 1. So now he tries to defend it with his rook. We're going to just capture that rook. And in this position, there's nothing that the queen can do to stop checkmate. Let's say the queen moves to d4 to try and get back here to help. Then we would just capture the bishop. We would check the king. The king can't move anywhere. He can't move even to g7 because our bishop's looking at it. That would be checkmate. This second example is a lot harder, but it is still all about the pin. And in this position, are there any pinned pieces? Well, we can see that this knight is not allowed to move. If it tries to move anywhere, we would eat the king. So what do we do when there's a pinned piece in a position? You attack the pinned piece. So how can we attack this pinned piece more times? Right now, our 2 rooks are looking at it. How else can we add another piece to attack? Hopefully you could all spot queen to g4. We've attacked the pinned piece. And now, how many pieces do we have attacking that knight? We've got 1, 2, 3. And how many do they have defending? They've got 1, 2. So it seems like we could just capture this piece, right? Although it seems like we can just capture here, we really have to think through the moves in our mind. So let's just do that real quick. Queen captures, rook captures, check. And we're left with 1 rook, 2 rooks, and they're left with 1 rook, 2 rooks. But we only have 3 pawns, and they have 5 pawns. So we're actually going to be in a losing position. So how can we take advantage of this capture here in a better way? Well, you might be thinking capture with the rook. And that is the way we would have to do it. Because if we capture with queen, we lose the queen, and we're left with 2 rooks. But if we capture with rook, we lose the rook and are left with queen and rook. So let's calculate through that real quick. Rook captures, queen captures, check. They'd be left with a rook, and we'd be left with a queen and a rook, and they'd also be in danger here. Now, they could actually win another pawn out of this if they do that intermezzo, so we need to calculate that as well. Capture the knight. Intermezzo check, they capture the pawn. We have to capture back this way. They take our rook, we take their queen, they take our rook, and now we're left with a queen on g6, and they're left with a rook on a1. So we would be in a winning endgame. So let's capture with the rook. Now they can capture here, but that is the end of the puzzle. Let's jump into tactic number 3, which is fairly similar to the pin. It's called the skewer. The skewer is where you attack a piece, and instead of pinning it to another more valuable piece, you force it to move away because it doesn't want to die, and you get a less important piece on the other side. So if we look at all the pieces that are lined up in this puzzle, I can see there's a rook here on d8, and there's a queen here on d1. And so if I were to attack the queen has to move away, and I could take the less valuable piece on the other side. However, this doesn't quite work because the queen on e5 can recapture on d8. So I wouldn't be able to win anything. Can you see any other pieces that are lined up in this example that we could force a more powerful piece to move away? And powerful is the wrong word. It's really a more important piece, and we get a less important piece on the other side. When doing skewer puzzles, you need to think about what are the most important pieces. So in chess, a pawn is worth 1 point, a knight is worth 3, a bishop is worth slightly more than 3, a rook is worth 5, a queen is worth 9, and the king is actually worth infinite. So the king is the most important piece, because if you lose him, you lose the game. So here we can see the king is lined up with the rook. Is there any way we can attack down this line and force the king to move away? Well, hopefully you can see queen takes g7, We have successfully skewered the king and the rook, and so it's the opposite of a pin. We've forced the more important piece to move away, and now we capture the less important piece. Let's jump into a more difficult skewer puzzle. Often in rook and king endgames, a skewer can win you the game. In this position, we can see that the king is lined up with the rook. And so you might be already seeing, oh, there's an idea of bringing the rook up to g8 to hit the king, force the king to move away, and then we take the rook. But if we were to just do that, they would get our rook and we would get their rook. So is there another way that we can actually make this happen? Maybe you're thinking, move this rook somewhere else. Let's say we moved our rook to b7. We're still keeping our rook on this whole file, and so the king can never come forwards onto this file. We're actually threatening checkmate on g8. But what can this king do? Instead of coming forwards, he could go to the left or to the right. And if he goes to the left, we still get checkmate. But if he goes to the right, then we can't skewer. And so we would actually completely lose this puzzle. So we need to find a better square for this rook to be on. And hopefully you can spot that idea. It is rook to h7, keeping the king trapped on this rank and covering all of these squares with the rook. And this piece, if it tries to come off of the 8th rank, we could just come over here and eat it. Now, there might be a way for our opponent to try to stop our idea, but this is definitely the best move because we still maintain this threat of skewering. Now, he's moved his rook to f3, so now he can come over here and block the skewer. So let's see. If we move our rook to h8, if he moves up, we're very happy because we get that rook on a8. But he doesn't have to move up. If we go rook h8, he can block. And then we capture, and he captures, and then we can't move up to g8 because he just eats us. So what is the one way that we can skewer this king to the rook? Hopefully you spotted checking with this rook first, because the rook on h7 is an extra square away. So we check here, he blocks, and now you can see we capture, and now we skewer. And we're up a rook in an endgame. We're going to win this one. Let's jump into tactic number 4. The discovered attack happens when you move one piece and a piece from behind now has more range and can attack. The only piece in chess that can't do a discovered attack is a knight. Now the knight could move out of the way and you attack with another piece, but the knight can never be the piece that has a discovered attack because knights can jump over pieces. So this tactic only really happens when you unleash the power of another piece by giving it more scope down the board. So in this position, let's have a look and see, are there any ways we can move one piece and attack with another piece from behind? If I move this rook, my rook on f8 can now look all the way over to a8. Now that doesn't do anything because there's no piece on a8 to capture. If I look at this bishop and I say, okay, I'm going to attack here, and now my queen can see all the way over to g6. Doesn't help because there's nothing on g6 to capture. So what piece can we move that gives one of our other pieces more scope? Hopefully you all spotted the beautiful pawn to c4. Now pawn to c4, we attack the queen, but we attack a piece more important than the queen. Yes, even though the queen's the most powerful, it's not the most important. The king is the most important on g1. We attack the king, and so our opponent is forced to protect the king. And now what can we do with this beautiful pawn on c4? We can take the enemy queen. That's a discovered attack. Let's jump into a slightly more difficult example. Discovered attacks don't always mean capturing pieces or material. It can also mean checkmate. So in this position, once we move one piece, the other piece behind has the ability to maybe capture or maybe have a big threat like checkmate. I can see here if I move my bishop, my rook can capture this pawn, doesn't do anything for me. I can also see that if I move this bishop, I can move my queen up to h7, which guards all these squares and hits the king and hits the king's retreating square. And so queen h7 is actually a checkmate threat. So where is the best place for this bishop to move so that we could deliver a checkmate? Well, hopefully you can see bishop to b7, and we are attacking the queen. Now, our opponent really should not take this bishop. They should move their king because the king is more important than the queen. But it looks like our opponent has just captured our bishop, so now we're able to deliver checkmate. That's pretty beautiful. Let's jump into something very similar to discovered attacks. This is the discovered check. The discovered check is very similar to the discovered attack. It's just when you move that piece out of the way, your piece at the back is actually checking the enemy king instead of just having more scope. So in this position, is there a way that we can force this king to be discovered checked on? Well, yeah, we can. We can move our rook to b8, and then we can move our knight, and the rook is going to discover check the king. This isn't amazing for us because what does a check here do for us? You know, the king can just walk away and we don't get anything from it. Well, we have to kind of set up the discovered check. So the idea is bringing the knight to e7. Now, when we come to e7, we check the king, and let's think about where the king might move. So the king goes over to this square. Our knight's here on e7. We can go here, attacking the king and attacking the rook. So he doesn't want to go to h8. His only other square that isn't a discovered check is king to f8. And the same thing happens here because when we jump with our knight, we're attacking the king on f8. We're also attacking the rook on h4. So the king can't go to these squares. So if we check him, he has to come forwards. And what does that enable? That enables us to move with our knight and check with the rook, wherever the king goes. So let's go knight to e7. Checking with the rook. So the king had to move. And now we take on h4. All right, let's do a discovered check, but a slightly more difficult one. This puzzle is pretty beautiful and it involves a sacrifice and discovered check in a way that you wouldn't really think about. In this position, we can see that we have a bishop and a rook lined up. And so if we want to discover check, we really need to hit the king on h1, but the king's not on h1. So the first step, how do we get the king onto h1? Well, hopefully you can see rook to h1. Now, if we put the rook on h1, the king could come here. Well, then we can move this rook somewhere and check with the bishop. So it would still be a discovered check. And not only that, the queen would have to block. We could take the queen. So it would actually be forced mate if the king comes to g2. So let's see, rook here, king here. Let's put our rook on e2, checking with the bishop, and he has to block, but he can't block because he's got a queen that is pinned to the king, and the rook on h1 is defending all these squares. So the bishop will deliver checkmate if the king comes to g2. Hopefully you're able to follow all that. I know that was a bit crazy, but we can still go here and draw the king onto h1, and now we have another discovered check. Now the question is, where do we move the rook so that we can check the enemy king? It might not be apparent. I always think when I have discovered checks, I should just attack the most important piece. And here I would always think, I got to attack that queen because then the king has to move and we capture the queen, and then the king moves again and we can capture this pawn, and we have a rook and a bishop in an endgame, and he's only got a rook and we're going to win. There's actually just a more beautiful way to win, which is rook to h4. Now, rook to e1 doesn't work because the king can go to h2 and we don't have any more checks. We come here, the rook eats us. But we can check on h4. The king can't come to g2 because of the bishop, and he can't come to h2 because of the rook. And so he only can go to this square. This was quite nice because he had to move the king. He couldn't block because if he blocks with the queen, the bishop is still looking at the king. And this is actually what's called a double check. The bishop's checking and the rook's checking, and double checks are my favorite chess tactics out of all the chess tactics. But this one is very beautiful. We can just put the rook on h1 now, and that is a checkmate. Okay, let's go to my favorite chess tactic of all time, the double check. The double check is very self-explanatory. You move one piece and you check with two pieces. There's only one possible way to do that in this puzzle. We move the knight, and where can we move it so that it checks the enemy king? Well, we have to move it to c4, and also our rook on d8 checks the king as well. So when we move to c4, the enemy can't take our knight because the rook is also checking the king. These are very beautiful puzzles when you have discovered checks in them. There's actually a very famous one in a chess book that I got a while back, and I will show that as the second example. But let me just play this out first. Check the king with the rook and the knight, and now we take the rook. He moves over here to c7, attacking our rook. We have to stop this pawn from promoting. We move to c8, and we're going to pick that up on the next turn. Okay, let me give you this harder example from a very famous game in chess history. This second example of a double check is one of the most beautiful that I've ever seen. This was played in 1910 between Richard Reti and Tartacar. Reti had the white pieces. And in this position, there's a force mate in 3 because of a double check, which is absolutely beautiful. Queen d8. The king's only move is to capture the queen. And here, how do you deliver a double check? Well, we could go here, checking with the rook and the bishop, or we could go here, checking with the bishop and the rook. And only one of them works. If we go this way, then the king can just walk to e8, the rook comes up, and the king can run away. But if we check this way, the king only has 2 squares where he can go. If he goes to e8, this is checkmate. A beautiful checkmate. The bishop holds the rook, and the rook covers the squares, and the bishop hits e7. And if the king goes this way, I think an even more beautiful checkmate. Bishop d8, hitting the king, cutting off the retreat, and the rook covers everything else. When I saw this in a puzzle book, it took me forever to figure it out. I knew there was something with a double check, but I just couldn't see this idea with the bishop. It's just beautiful. I hope you guys start to spot this in your own games. Okay, let's jump into the next chess tactic. I've been playing chess a long time, and the very first tactic that I ever learned was removing the defender. And it really is as simple as it sounds. If you want to take a piece, but you can't because it's defended, first take the defender away, and then you can take the piece. In this position, there's a bishop attacking our queen. Now we want to remove the defender. We want to eat this bishop, but this knight is defending the bishop. So we need to get rid of this knight first. How do we get rid of the knight first? Well, we could take, but if we take, don't they eat our queen? No, because when we take, we actually check the enemy king. So we check the enemy king, and we win the knight, so they're going to probably capture us with the pawn or the queen, and then we can eat the bishop on g5. So let's remove the defender of the bishop. And now we eat the bishop. All right, let's jump into a slightly more difficult removing the defender puzzle. In this puzzle, we have a knight sitting on c7, and we want to get rid of this knight. We want to eat it. But there's a queen defending the knight. So if we just take here, the queen will eat us. And that's not cool. So how can we get rid of this queen? Well, we just need to attack it. And how do we attack it and remove it from defending this knight? Well, I can see 2 ways to attack it currently. The first is knight h5 attacking the queen. And the second way I can see to attack it is e5 attacking the queen. Now, if I go knight h5, the queen can keep defending by just moving up to d6. And I don't really know how I remove the queen from defending the knight. I'm going to have to just end up moving my rook, and then the knight can jump away and keep attacking my rook, and I don't really get anything. But if I see the move e5, the queen is not looking at the knight anymore. So let's think about e5. If we go e5, what is the enemy going to do? You're probably all thinking he just captures e5. And now the queen's on e5, and I think, okay, how are we going to remove the queen from e5? Well, let's think about knight g4 or d6. Well, knight g4, the queen can just go to d6. So what about playing d6 ourselves, attacking the queen on e5? The queen can't capture because we eat the queen with our queen. The queen has to run away to another square, and then we take the knight because we have a pawn on d6. So let's do that. e5, d6, they run away, and we capture the knight. This 8th chess tactic is a little more complex, I think. I didn't actually learn about this chess tactic until much later in my chess life, but it's just called overloading. Maybe a helpful way to think about this tactic is you have a big dump truck, and you put all the trash into the dump truck, and then you put more trash into the dump truck, and you put so much trash into the dump truck that the dump truck explodes, and now there's trash everywhere, and you've won the game. Now, your opponent is the dump truck, and you want to overload them with so much pressure. Currently in this position, I can see that there is an overload tactic. And that is because I can see I'm attacking a bishop over here and I'm attacking a knight over here. And who's defending both of those pieces? The queen. So if we simply capture one of the pieces, the queen will recapture us, and then we can capture the other one. We've overloaded that queen. She's a dump truck. She's got all this trash to carry. We're just going to pile it up. We're going to exchange some of that trash so that we can capture the rest of the trash in our second move. So there's two ways to capture: queen takes or knight takes. Now, obviously, the queen's going to capture whatever piece we attack with. So if we capture with queen, they're going to get our queen. If we capture with knight, they're going to get our knight. Now, if you remember back on the first or second tactic of this video, I said that every piece has value, and the queen is worth 9 and the knight is worth about 3. And so we want to give them our knight. So we're going to capture here. The queen captures, and now the queen has been overloaded, and we can now capture the other piece that is no longer defended. Okay, let's jump into a second example that is slightly more complex. In this position, hopefully you can see that again, the queen is overloaded because she's defending two pieces. She's had to move over here to g3 so that she can defend her rook on f2 and defend her rook on e5. Now, you could say this rook was already defended, but we're actually attacking it twice. So she really did need to help the king defend this rook. We can see that we can capture this rook two ways. We also see that we can capture this rook with our queen. Now, let's say we capture this rook with our queen. Now we only have one attacker on the rook on f2, and they have one defender. So we don't have more attackers than defenders. So it would be very stupid of us to capture this rook, because then they take our queen, and that's all we could do. So now we need to consider, can we attack this rook and remove the defender so that we could take this one? Well, if we want to take this one, how are we going to attack this one? Are we going to take with the queen? No, because then we wouldn't be able to take on e5. So we have to take with our rook on f8. So let's capture. And now they've thrown in what is called an intermezzo. Now, I did mention intermezzo earlier in the video, but I didn't explain what it is. It's an in-between move where you make a move in between the opponent's plans that confuses everything. If we just take this rook now, they're going to capture our queen. So that wouldn't be good because we haven't actually removed the defender of this rook. If we move our queen, let's say we go for a check here, well, the king can just take our rook and we're just losing because they've got a queen, bishop, rook, and we've got a queen, bishop, knight, and knight's not as good as rook. So we really have to come up with our own move to still remove that defender of the rook here. How can we remove the queen as a defender of e5? Well, we need to attack the queen because right now our queen's in danger. So we need to put their queen in danger. How can we put their queen in danger? We could go here or we could go here. Well, if we go to g2, the king can capture and we haven't removed the queen as a defender. So instead, we're going to move our rook to f3. Now, if they wanted to, they could capture here, but then we capture here with check, and the king has to move. Let's say the king comes here, and then we capture a pawn. And so we're actually doing okay in that endgame. But in this puzzle, they've just captured our rook. And so we can capture their rook. And we've successfully removed the queen as a defender of the rook on e5. All of that was because we were able to overload that queen's defenses. She had to defend the rook on f2. We forced her away on f3. And finally, we got that rook. The decoy tactic is where you lure the enemy piece to a vulnerable square so that you can do something else. The deflection tactic is where you sort of pull that piece away from its usually defensive duties so that you can capitalize off the position. So in this position, we have a queen and a king. And I can see that I would love to take this queen. It's only defended by the king. So how do we remove the defender or deflect the king from defending the queen? We're not actually removing the defender, which is the king. We're not getting rid of the king, but we are removing him with his duties of defending, which is slightly different. So in this position, I can't attack this king, but I can remove the king from defending the queen. And now we can capture the queen. And now we can take the rook. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense. This second example is very tricky, and it is actually a checkmating pattern that you need to learn for your endgames. In this puzzle, we're not actually deflecting the king off of its defensive duties because it's not defending either of these pieces, but instead we are tactically keeping it on h1 so that we can checkmate him. So the first thing we're going to do is move our king to f2. When we do that, we check with the rook, and we also set up a beautiful barricade with the king. So this king might want to walk over this way so that he can escape, but it's our move right now. And now what we want to do is not deflect the king off of his defensive duties, but instead decoy the king back into the corner. The special move here is decoying the king to h1. Now, how do we check the enemy king safely? Well, there's two squares. There's one here and one here. If we check on d5, we're going to get eaten by the enemy queen. So we have to go to b1. The king moves up, and now we have a checkmate in 1. The beautiful queen to h7. The king is guarding these squares, and now the queen cuts through the rest of them. That is called a decoy tactic because we decoyed the king over to h1 so that we could get a free check in here so that when he comes back to h2, we have the checkmate set up. Now you might be wondering back in this position, what if the queen takes on h1? Well, it's actually fairly simple. We just would capture on g8 and we're hitting these squares with our queen, and the queen is not able to get to any square to check our king. So let's say the queen moves over here. Well, then we just have a check, the queen blocks, and checkmate. The same exact kind of pattern. If the queen moves to e1, checking the king, well then we just take it, and we still have our queen on g8, and we're going to deliver a checkmate in a few moves. But yeah, hopefully that makes a bit of sense. This tactic was extremely difficult, I think, and I think decoy deflection is much more advanced. But the final chess tactic of this video is the interference tactic. So let's jump into that right now. Here we have the final chess tactic that you need to know. It's called the interference tactic, and basically what it is where you put one of your pieces in between two of the enemy pieces to stop their protection of each other or their communication. So in this position, we can see our enemy has 3 pieces. And can we put a piece in between these two? Well, if I draw an arrow between them, you can see there's no square that I can actually put a piece in between the two because they're not on the same diagonal, they're not on the same rank or the same file. However, these 2 pieces are on the same rank. They are on the 6th rank here, and they're both looking at each other. And how can I interfere their communication? Well, I could put my queen on e6. Putting my queen on e6 means the enemy queen is not defending the knight, but they could just eat us. So let's look at rook b6. Rook b6 is protected by the pawn on a7. And so the queen can't eat me, and we're interfering the queen's defense of the knight. So the move here is rook b6. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense. Let's have a look at a much more difficult example. This final example, I hope, is quite challenging for you guys. You can pause the video if you want to try to solve it on your own, but I'll go through it now with you guys. We have a pawn here that really wants to promote. However, they have a bishop that is on a dark square, and we're going to promote on a dark square. And so if they can just get their bishop onto this diagonal, we might be in a bit of trouble. However, we can interfere the communication of this bishop and our promoting square, the pawn on this square. So you can see here, sometimes interference is not between two enemy pieces, but sometimes it's between one of your pieces and one of the enemy pieces. And so how can we interfere in that? Well, let's have a look here. We're going to push our pawn because we want to promote. He brings his bishop here to c3, getting ready to eye this up. Now, all he has to do is move his pawn out of the way. Now, how can we stop him from moving his pawn out of the way? Well, we can go d4. So now he's captured on d4. How can we promote? Well, if we do, we're just getting checked. We're going to take here, and the bishop can pull all the way back here and defend. So we definitely shouldn't be promoting the pawn. We need to stop this pawn from moving. And how can we stop this pawn from moving? Well, we have bishop d3 or king d3. But if we go king d3, then all of a sudden this pawn is going to promote, and we're going to be too far away from it. We need to stay within the square of where this pawn wants to come. So we need to use our bishop to block this pawn from walking forwards and allowing the enemy bishop to see the h8 square. So we've caused the enemy's own pawn to interfere between the bishop and this promotion square. Now we can advance, and the king can't catch us, and the bishop can't stop us. What a beautiful tactic. Which of these tactics was your favorite? Were there any that were new to you? Please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you guys. Again, do check out the free Noctie puzzle study that I made. Link in the description of the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all very soon.